Hello, everyone. Welcome. So we're doing two assignments this week, right? The War for Independence, or if you consider it a revolution, and the Confederation that we lived under prior to this republic. This technically is our second government. Okay, and so let me get down the names. Okay, and as I'm doing so, are there any questions or comments? Anything that I need to be aware of? How are you guys doing?
Doing well.
Good, good. That's good to hear, Xander. I finally, um, there are 84 of you or 86 of you. So I beg your indulgence. I finally finished your first assignment. So hopefully you got a little bit of feedback finally, and that's going to continue. Obviously, I need to play catch up at this point, but hopefully you guys are doing okay as far as your understanding of what my subjective expectations are in this class. And I got to tell you, there you guys are pretty spot on right off the bat with your very first assignment in analyzing these and evaluating them. So remember, to one extent, it's a little bit like a summary. You're just saying what the main thesis statement was that kind of synthesized everything together into the section that you chose, and then you were just briefly stating, how it was, how that thesis was supported. And then after that, you were evaluating why you do or do not find that thesis to be fair, complete, credible. Okay. But like I said, I was rather impressed with the first assignment. You guys seem to have surmised what I was looking for right off the bat. And I'm proud of you for that. And I'm also proud of you for the uniquely, efficient pace of this class. It's crazy. Like I said, I'm accustomed during the fall and the spring to an assignment per week. And boy, you guys are doing two, sometimes even three assignments per week because of the short semester, the short nature of the semester. So I'm especially proud of you for that. We're really on the run, so to speak. But it never ceases to. I'm never surprised anymore that I truly, I gain a perspective on a given section, a point that's being brought up by many of you that I had not previously thought about. I'm very proud of you in your intelligence. I look forward to looking at these. Okay, and so I don't know if you've had a chance to take a look at these two assignments, but we'll do so right now. Okay, I believe I am the world's worst multitasker, but I believe we are. I finally have written down all the names. Okay. So looking at this, right, I begin with a brief, well, somewhat brief introduction, right, of what is kind of, I consider to be almost universally considered context. Remember, context is the surrounding situation, right? The surrounding data and historical circumstances from which you look at a given topic and try to derive meaning from it, much less try to construct a narrative. When it gets into causation in history, right, that's very subjective. What caused the war for independence? What really propelled it? What does it really stand for? That is a highly contested question, right? And so different historians that have come from Ivy League schools, um, they differ in opinion on that. Okay, so that I want you to always keep that in mind. That's one of the large premises I have behind this type of an assignment, an argumentative assignment, is to be aware of that. So hopefully it makes it a little more interesting when it's an argumentative format. Hopefully, the very few of you who go on to become history majors, I'd like to think that I'm giving you a little early step in what's to come, because you'll get into historiography, the art and science of history, and how it varies in different schools of thought and so forth, right? So you're getting kind of an early look at that, and you get to critically think a little bit, right? And so looking at this, if you're an historian who believes in a revolution, and remember, if something is revolutionary, to me, it constitutes a 180-degree turn in the three realms that historians tend to put history in: political realm, economic realm, and social realm. Okay. And so if you believe that it was a revolution, chances are you're going to really focus upon the ideological parts of this time period, right? The French and Scottish Enlightenments, the Great Awakening, right? And you're going to look at a lot of the propaganda at this time, and perhaps believe that Americans at this time were really adhering to what they were reading and what they were being told through different mediums, right? And that they had principles upon which they stood. And so in looking at that, you're going to look at things like um, these intellectual movements. So for instance, right, you have Rome, Plutarch and his makers of Rome, Cicero and Tacitus. There was a guy named Montesquieu, and he wrote in his book, The Spirit of the Laws, that the Enlightenment, by the way, was predominantly really took flight in the 1740s. So kind of a generation just prior to this this rebellion of ours in 1775 to 1783 against the British, right, to become independent. And so he stressed that the English Constitution he thought was the best balance to him, right? Like Aristotle said, like all things in moderation and balance and proper balance. He felt like England had a republic by his time period. And by republic, I keep it simple in my own mind with Aristotle. There's elements of a monarchy, of a strong executive. There's elements of an aristocracy. Remember, aristoi meant the best in Greek. And so a group of kind of an elite who were well educated and kind of groomed to rule well and rule intelligently and with wisdom, and they're well read, etc. And then you have elements of a democracy, the demos, or the common people, right? Ruled by the common people. And so when you look at the Constitution of England itself, right, he said that England provided the best proper balance, the closest approximating balance that the world had to offer in Montesquieu's and his generation. But he felt like it was imperative for the health and the survival of a republic for there to be civic virtue, for those who are in power to rule with the right motives, for philosophy in particular, right? And then of course later on Judeo-Christian values when Rome fell and the church became so strong as an institution and cultural influence, that people do not rule for the wrong reasons, not for self-enrichment, not for their ego and power, and that you keep those types of people from having the term often used was arbitrary power, power to do whatever they pleased and not be restricted in any sense. The Scottish Enlightenment was real big against that. So at any rate, Cicero, Tacitus, right, Plutarch and his makers of Rome, they give models and anti-models for that type of ideal politician who is supposed to be selfless, put the republic first, the general well-being and the general welfare first, right, is not inclined to abuse power, etc. So you have that element to the Enlightenment. Because they looked at classic Greece and Rome, right, predominantly. John Locke in his second treatise on government, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his book called The Social Contract, they philosophically derived a hypothesis about the first governments created by man. And the idea was, as you liken it to like, a group of us going on a trip, right, to some remote Pacific island. And God forbid, as a class, we go and the plane crashes, but we somehow survive the crash, but we're marooned on that island. And so technically we resorted to a state of nature, right? In which there are no actual legally recognized institutions. And it's kind of each man and woman for him or herself. And so the idea was that living in a state of nature, they surmised, man enjoyed a natural right, what he believed to be his natural biological right, God-given right to autonomy, to be the arbiter, the decider of his or her own destiny in day-to-day decisions, etc. Right? However, they both stated that man being who he is, they resorted kind of like to the Judeo-Christian notion of the original sin, right? The fall of Adam and Eve, that we have a sinful inclination in us, and that it is inevitable in a state of absolute freedom, in a state of nature, that some people will abuse that freedom, and they will use that freedom to step upon the natural rights of other people. And of course, the natural rights they kind of summarized into life, liberty, and property, right? And so naturally in that state of nature as a class, let's say hypothetically, we have people desperate for food and sustenance begin perhaps extorting other people, saying, I'm going to physically hurt you if you do not fish for me and catch me some fish to eat and cook it for me, etc. This is probably a very silly, rudimentary example. But at any rate, that one by one, some of the members of our class might begin losing our natural freedoms in a state of nature because others are abusive of that freedom. So then, hence, government is surmised to be a necessary evil, but it's to be limited, right, as a necessary evil in scope and size and shape, etc., and power. So at any rate, by common consent, the idea is in these books, if my memory serves me correctly, I'm going back to the 90s, having read these in college. But at any rate, we get together and we decide, right? We're going to elect a certain contingent of us to be the policemen and the protectors and the guarantors of our freedoms, right? And so hence they're not our masters, they're our servants to protect our natural rights, to make sure our life, liberty, and property, our rights thereto are protected. And if they cease to do their job, if they fail to do their job, then it's our right to concoct a revolution, if you will, and remove them from power and put in a group of people, elected people, who will successfully protect our life, liberty, and property, right? And so it's something to think about. But that was the notion that's what this generation was somewhat familiar with. Now, there's a guy named Bernard Bailyn, and he has a book called The Ideological Origins of the Revolution. That title says a lot, right? He thinks it was a revolution. He thinks it was a lot about ideas and about principles upon which we fought. And I would call that court history, right? Because, an average country, court history adheres to American exceptionalism, that we are a special, exceptional country. We're better than the average country. And what is an average country born upon? Ambition, desire for resources, power, right, etc. There's nothing really romantic about any of that. But with America, right, they contend that we fought for freedom. We fought for these lofty principles, and that's what makes things Americana, exceptional, right? So something to think about. So in his book, right, he runs into the dilemma of, okay, wait a minute though, what is how big was our literati, right? Our intellectual class who had time to read these books, 300 pages in French, sometimes, right? Who has the opportunity to do such? He he rightfully concedes that a very small contingent of our population had the opportunity, the time, the means, the educational background to really imbibe these works, right? And so you look at people like James Otis, Dickinson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, right? And he includes them into this elite group of the literati, okay? But then having read this stuff, right, he contends that they disseminated these principles, right? In a very palatable form, a form in which the average uneducated American could learn from them, right? And so the main mean or medium that he contends that they used were speeches and pamphlets. Pamphlets, oftentimes, like the famous one from Thomas Paine called Common Sense, were oftentimes no more than about 35 pages. So, and they also put them in the nomenclature, in the language that the average person could read, not in this kind of fancy Baroque language that these writers were actually writing their works in. Okay, so they contend that they were able to, our American literati were able to disseminate these types of ideas to the common people through common palatable means that the people could understand, had time to read, and hence could be influenced by. All right. Diderot and Condorcet, they wrote the encyclopedias. They contended that it was a natural right for people to be able to cultivate themselves, to better themselves, to rise up socioeconomically as high as their talents would allow them to rise, to become educated, even if it was to become self-educated, to have access to books and learning. Okay. And so to me, I tie this second one to the pursuit of happiness mentioned in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. All right. I do subjectively. He had read this stuff. And I believe that's somewhat what he meant in putting that kind of nebulous term down as one of our natural rights. Voltaire, right, was all about expression and tolerance of freedom of expression, right? One of his disciples, a well-to-do woman, was noted to have said, "I disagree with what you have to say, but I defend to the death your right to say it." And that says a lot, right? And so with Voltaire, he was deliberately an iconoclast, right? I think of like South Park, with iconoclasm, right? Is you deliberately, you philosophically attack that which society holds to be sacred for supposedly the right reasons. You want people to be able to. You don't want anything held to be taboo. You want to be able to have critical thinking. You want to look at any institution in a critical light so that you could improve it, right? And so, hence, Voltaire went after back in France. He went after the Roman Catholic hierarchy in church, right? And religion itself, Christianity itself. Beccaria, he included among natural rights the rights of suspects if you were suspected of having committed a crime. Because you have to remember, from the early modern era, they still had vestiges, remnants of the medieval era, right? Because like in most things in life, it's not clean. It's a slow, messy evolution. And so you still had instances in which kings and queens, I think of like, uh, oh gosh, with the Chateau d'If, right? Alexander Dumas's book. I can't believe the name is eluding me right now. It's one of my favorite books. But the Count of Monte Cristo, right? Whereby you might have information that could get someone in authority in trouble. You witness something, etc. And for that reason, they just throw you into a dungeon and you're not seen again. Nothing even approximating due process, right? Rights to defend yourself in court and have an ample reason and grounds for which you are convicted of a crime that actually exists, right? And according to the jurisprudence and the law. And so Beccaria was really into that. Adam Smith, in his Wealth and Poverty of Nations, wrote about having a capitalist economy, a free market, right? Whereby he thought that there are natural laws, especially with human psychology and interaction and sociology, before that term was used, um, that will help regulate a free economy. And also, right, as an undergirding premise, not only that it has a beneficial effect to open up the economy, but an undergirding assumption was that that is what's fair, that is kind of included as a natural right, for human beings is, again, kind of like the pursuit of happiness, um, to pursue your best interest as an individual and as a family, etc. Okay, Wollstonecraft wrote the Vindication of the Rights of Women, and wrote that women ought to have the same natural rights as men. And of course, that did not take hold in the War for Independence very well, but nevertheless, it was stated, right? And the term that was used in the pejorative was the Ancien regime, uh, life before the Enlightenment, right? And in France, they're going to conclude it as life before the French Revolution, the old school way of doing things, church and state being melded together, an aristocracy ruling, kings and queens having somewhat arbitrary power, like the power of Louis XIV. Okay. Um, and that was all held in a negative light, and all that needed to change. That they didn't want people to be credulous, for one thing, right? Credulity is like being naive, that you simply imbibe, you drink in whatever you read, whatever you're told in speeches, whatever the authoritative figures preach to you in mass or church. You just take it in, and you take it as gospel truth, and you don't question it. They did not want people to be that way. They wanted them to be critical thinkers, and to be more, you know, just more critical of the leading institutions and the way things are done, right? I think of Machiavelli. Yes, he wrote The Prince, and he wrote how to be an absolute prince over a city state in Italy, but he also wrote on a republic, and in that he went the opposite route, and he stated how people need to be vigilant as citizens to keep a republic alive, to hold on to their freedoms. And you have these kind of almost conspiracy theories that they're warned against, right? So for one, right, is the idea of, they called it Robinocracy. I have no idea why, I don't recall, but the idea that kings and queens are going to try to use a combination of fear and enticement to lull their people to sleep. That fear is pretty obvious, right? Use their standing army, use their police force to try to cow people into allegiance and obedience, but also, right, that they're going to try to bribe and win over, especially aristocrats. They're going to grant them monopolies to the slave trade, to the sugar trade, to other types of lucrative economic ventures. And they're going to try to win their possible rivals over and kind of lull them to sleep. And also, Machiavelli was ahead of his time, as he said, also, as technology increases, people are going to be tempted to tend their own garden, as the Romans called it, right? They're going to get into consumerism and wanting to buy the latest technological marvels and indulge in that consumerism. And they're going to want to live their own private, comfortable lives without really reading the newspaper, seeing what their government is up to, being vigilantly jealous and guarding their rights and privileges, and making sure that those rights are not being eroded. And the idea was, right, is that rights will be eroded. And you see this in historiography of Nazi Germany, even, right, during World War II, is that Hitler did not just use fear. He backed down. He initially backed down, for instance, with the established churches in Germany. He backed down when he tried to implement clauses with the mentally and physically disabled, uh, to separate them and to keep them from procreating, and even to have them sadly killed. He backed down when he faced fierce opposition. So he didn't just use fear, right? He also used accommodation and cunning, right? And so what he would do is oftentimes just do things incrementally, one small step at a time, to try to lull the people away from their justified suspicions, and to get them to put their guard down. And that's what they warned against in the Enlightenment. They warned that once one right and then another right were taken back from the people, look out. It's going to start a negative domino effect whereby they're eventually going to return you to a state of tyranny and of bondage, right? And so that's important to remember when you get into these taxes in the War for Independence, right? Because the taxes were economically, it's not really disputed, rather nominal, just in name only. That they were not onerous, they were not burdensome. These taxes on lead, paint, tea, etc., that Parliament began imposing on the colonies. But the idea was, right, is wait a minute, we have gone over a century of through English political tradition and practice and history to have the elected assemblies in each of the 13 colonies give their approval to taxes first, right? So if they're going to take away that right of the assemblies to give their consent to taxes, what's going to come tomorrow and the next day and the next day? So that's important to remember as far as our rhetoric, at least what we preached, is contending that it was the principle, not the tax itself, that we were opposing. Okay, then the Scottish Enlightenment. This is probably simplistically summarized, but to me, a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment that I've come across was very libertarian, right? Remember, libertarian is that you fear government, you believe that there is an innate characteristic in man. I think of like perhaps like the Lord of Rings or something, putting that ring on, whereby his appetite for power is insatiable. That if you give too much power to any individual, he or she will inevitably abuse it. That there's something in our nature that will abuse it if we can. I think of John Adams and him corresponding with Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson told Adams, "You know as well as I that even you and I would become wolves if the people allowed us to become such." And so with that, right, they wanted limited powers. They wanted civic codes implemented into the law of the land in Great Britain as of 1707, Scotland and England, right, together. But at any rate, they wanted laws implemented that individually protected subjects of the British Crown, that protected their natural rights, okay, and their British rights, their civic or man-made rights. And so they wanted rights, right, like the right to assemble and peacefully protest, the right to bear arms. That was big in the Scottish Enlightenment, because they thought, fear the day when a standing army has a monopoly on weaponry, and it can turn on its own people whenever it chooses to. And so they were big with that kind of stuff. And so they also, in the Scottish Enlightenment, they were really against the established Church of England, the Anglican Church. They didn't like the way that the Anglican clergy were granted political positions, were granted the right to mandatory tithes or 1/10 of the people's income by law. And so they wanted, many of them wanted a separation of church and state. I think of like Benjamin Hoadley, who was against the clerical abuses of power at this time. So England itself, and Scotland and England itself, you had movements that were for democratizing England. And another thing that I should have mentioned right off the bat as context that I think is relevant to this subject is the nature of the English Constitution. It's organic, right? It's a combination of judicial decisions, parliamentary laws, and kings and queens edicts, right? And it was meant to evolve. And so the good part of that is that the English common law, as it was known, right, was rather liquid. It was open to be reformed, to change, to improve, etc. Right, and the Whig Party, the WHIG Party of England, they were very proud of that fact because they wanted to take advantage of Parliament's power in particular after the English Civil War of 1642 to 49. You have the English Civil War, and Charles the First is going to be beheaded as the English king, and Parliament is going to gain supremacy over the crown. Then you had the Glorious Revolution of 1688, whereby William and Mary had to sign their subservience to the English Constitution and to Parliament. Okay, so the Whigs were very proud of that, and they wanted to take advantage of court cases as well as parliamentary laws to further democratize England, right? In a very lawful, in the spirit of law and order, right? Without having a bloody revolution like they'll have soon in France, to do it in an evolutionary manner. Okay, and so that's the Whig Party. There were no neat lines of just Whigs versus the Tories, the conservatives, but by and large, those who did stand up for the rights of American colonists when we began to be taxed directly by Parliament without our assembly's consent tended to be Whigs. And that makes sense, right? Because they wanted England to become further democratized in evolutionary fashion. And hence many of those who were wanting to be tough on the American colonies, to put us in our place, to let us learn, once and for all, that Parliament is supreme. Many of them tended to be Tories, the Conservative Party back in England. So I've heard some people liken the American War for Independence to Vietnam for England. They're going to be very conflicted to a large degree, although the votes early on with these taxes don't really convey that. I believe it was like 249 to 75 or something like that was the vote. So an overwhelming majority in the House of Commons were okay with the stamp tax and some of these other taxes put directly upon the colonists. Okay. Um, like I said, you had the Great Awakening. And with the Great Awakening, it was an egalitarian religious movement, right? Trying to put people more on democratic equal footing, whereby they contended that the church should not have this arbitrary power over the constituency, over the average Christian in the English realms. Okay, they wanted it to limit those powers. Also, they even went further than that, and they dabbled with the idea of conditional deference. Remember, deference is knowing your place, obeying the authorities, etc. Right? But they said that some of them wrote that deference is conditional, and what they used as their ultimate source of authority is the Bible itself. And they contended, right, that the people that when the leaders cease to obey God and cease to do their God-given duty as the clergymen, then it is the right and even the obligation of the laymen, the non-clerical Christian people of the English realms to defy them. Okay. And so this Great Awakening, it was very egalitarian in its message. And the idea was is that this carried over because, for one, the Anglican Church was the official state church in 9 of the 13 colonies as royal colonies, right? And so they were given political positions as well, et cetera, that was contested. But secondly, was that type of mindset carried itself over to the secular realm. That if you can get yourself right, because remember, you oftentimes, it was a very predominant, salient habit in the English realms, including the colonies, to do a family prayer over your meal, and then end with a toast to the King or Queen of England, right? But so in order to psychologically make that large step, whereby you're saying, you know what, I am not going to defer any longer to King George III and to Parliament, etc. That takes a big psychological step, right, in your culture. And so hence they think that the Great Awakening played a big role in doing that, as well as this Enlightenment, Scottish and French Enlightenment propaganda that was going in the form of pamphlets, posters, speeches, in the newspapers and almanacs, A lot of people were writing anonymously under a pseudonym, right? A lot of our founding fathers, who ended up becoming our founding fathers, did that. And they would cite these Enlightenment works. They would cite these Great Awakening phrases, etc., to try to provoke the people to become bold enough to defy their authorities, right? And to say, I'm no longer deferring to you because you have abused your power. And because you have followed in the form of the Anglican Church, you have failed to continue to follow God and to do your God-given, to perform your God-given role. Okay. So all of this is considered context if you are a court historian like Bernard Bailyn, who believes that this was a revolution, that it brought about a completely different, more egalitarian worldview, that we're fighting for these principles, some of which that I've just gone over, right? To make a whole new, open, democratic, egalitarian, freedom-loving world here in the American colonies, breaking free from England. All right. And so I've gone over a lot of those. So I think I'm gonna. So remember that what I mentioned with John Locke and with Rousseau is known as the social contract. All right, that governments are our servants, not our masters, and they exist. They are legitimate only in that they have our consent, our permission, and only in that they protect our natural rights, namely life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so any questions so far? Okay, another thing that's considered relevant to this time period are demographics. And you'll see that in number 4. Howard Zinn holds that to be highly relevant to what's going on. As in the intro, right, was mentioned also, there was a population explosion in the 1700s. All right. We know that from several sources. And so now, right, England in winning the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War against France, they're going to secure domination, right, hegemony over the North American continent. But now suddenly the population is burgeoning, it's taking off, right? You have the simultaneous phenomenon of urbanization, of people moving into Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, Boston, and exquisitely large numbers, right? And that, as you see there, that the cities were, quote, ill-equipped to handle them, okay? So you have that phenomenon. And where am I going with this, you guys? Is that these changes are going to convince George III of England, convince the Tories and the Whigs back in Parliament, back in England itself, that that there needs to be an administrative makeover, if you will, in North America to handle these changes. That they had just fought and, quote, won North America from the French. But if they didn't do something about it, they were going to lose it as soon as they had gained it, because they needed to grab a better hold over these colonies. And another thing that needs to be mentioned also is that the war cost 137 million shillings to the English treasury. So now they are indebted at the end of this war, and they're feeling a large political obligation to try to climb out of that debt and try to bring about as much revenue as possible to maximize revenue for the coffers of England, right? And so hence, you find in the PBS video on the War for Independence, if you wanted to look that up, just YouTube that, you'll find a very practical bent, according to the primary sources of the British, that a lot of them didn't initially set out to say, okay, we want to make sure for once and for all with this kind of nebulous English constitutional common law, it hasn't been stated explicitly yet. So we want to make a point in contending that Parliament speaks for Britain and for all her colonies, whether you have an elected rep in Parliament or not. In which, of course, you know the answer to that. We did not elect anyone from any of the 13 colonies into Parliament. So no one was directly representing us. But you don't find a lot of that, to be honest, from what I've covered with the primary sources of that time period. Instead, you see a much more kind of arrogant and practical approach where they just said, hey, we're in debt. We need to raise money. And the colonies need to carry their weight. We're not putting any taxes on them that we have not already put on the English people themselves. Here they are, our colony, and they're paying fewer taxes than the English people back in England proper. And that doesn't seem right to us, right? And so, hence, you have evidence of this kind of arrogant attitude that, of course, we're not worried about them rebelling against these taxes. It's only natural. It's only fair. After all, right? We fought against the French and their Native American allies who were killing American colonists on the frontier of the frontiers of Maryland and Virginia and Pennsylvania and New York, right? Because after all, you find that as another common theme. As American colonists, when the best seats in the House tended to be already occupied, politically, economically, especially, and socially, on the east coast of the 13 colonies, those who were kind of poor but ambitious tended to move to the west and go out on the western periphery of their colonies, right, to strike it out on their own, if you will. But moving on to the western periphery, they ran into Native American tribes. And the French were pretty adept at currying the favor and the alliance of many of the Native American tribes who resented American English colonists moving into their territories. So the French promised them autonomy, given back their lands, etc. So many of them fought against American colonists, the Native Americans, that is. So the English had some credibility in stating that we partially fought this French and Indian War for you, American colonists, to secure the Western peripheries, for instance, for your settlement and for your safety against Native American attacks, etc. So it's only right that you began paying your taxes. Another thing that was part of this undergirding, kind of practical yet a little bit arrogant assumption by the English was the fact that in England itself, not everyone was represented. There were villages, hamlets, cities, and districts known as boroughs that did not directly get to elect anyone into the House of Commons. Okay, and so hence there was not universal direct representation in England itself. So they're like, what are you crying about? You're contending a right that's not even recognized in England itself. But yet there were um, uh, kind of protests that were going on in England itself for that very phenomenon. I think of like John Wilkes, who contended that he was represented as people, that he was in a rotten borough that had no one representing them. He insisted upon running for Parliament into the House of Commons. He was elected, and the king removed him from Parliament and said that he was a rabble rouser, a troublemaker, and he had no right, that he was just going to be a cancer in the House of Commons. And so there was a lot of protest to this, right, back in England itself. So England was having its own tumultuous democratic uprisings, if you will, in England itself at this time. But they thought, heck, if we haven't granted direct representation to the English people themselves, what are you crying about as our colony in a more subjugated jurisdiction as a colony belonging to England? So at any rate, and I find it very interesting, there was a man named Colonel Isaac Barr, Barre, and you could look up a quote of his, and it's very telling of more of an American perspective. I'm going off the book of Robert Middlecoff called The Glorious Cause. And to some extent, it's court history, and I have to keep that in mind, that it's being a little bit romantic, but at the same time, it does imply self-interest on behalf of the founding fathers, being heavily involved in their motivations, um, uh, constant friction and power grabs within the colonies themselves. So it's not a neatly coherent court history either. Um, but at any rate, he says Isaac Barr gets up and says, I'm warning you, Parliament, the Americans are not going to see it this way. They see, however true it is or not, perception is reality to them. They see themselves as having carved out their lives for themselves and by themselves. That when you go back to Jamestown, when you go back to Plymouth and Puritan Boston, and in the 1680s, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, etc. When you go back to these periods, you find evidence of people fighting with Native Americans without the British Army's help, contending with them on their own, carving out and squatting on or purchasing small homesteads and farming their own produce and rising up on their own merit. That they don't feel as if Mother England, as if they owe Mother England almost anything, that they have done it on their own by themselves. And he says they have grown accustomed to their assemblies, right, giving their consent to taxes and to laws that are to be followed. And so if you suddenly take that away, you usurp that, right? And contend that Parliament speaks for them whether they like it or not. And they're going to begin taxing them and doing these other things. He says, I assure you, you think they're just going to bite their lip and take this in the chin. He says, I assure you they won't. That they have grown accustomed and believe that they have done it on their own, and that you will incur the wrath of the colonies if you go forth with this stamp tax. So, at any rate, that's something else to consider. But also, right, is at the same time as urbanization, as I mentioned before, is the fact that a lot of Americans are going to move away from the cities into the western peripheries, and especially when you look at the Carolinas, you could look up the regulator movement. When you look up the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania, when you look at the Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, especially New York, you're going to find instances of poor people in these newer Western regions, right, began to mandate to give forth like, like the Spanish mandato, like commands, right, contending we want to be represented in the assembly. The assembly is our voice, right? And we have no one elected from our Western region into the assembly. And Howard Zinn's book is good on this, A People's History of the US. And he shows how there was a rich versus poor, Western versus Eastern establishment, kind of civil discord that was going on in the colonies at this time. And so that to some people is very relevant context, right, to the war for independence, as we're going to see with number 4. All right. So are there any questions? Okay. And then the actual events, I have it on here. But let's see here. Let me find it. So you have your proclamation of 1763, whereby British Parliament is going to declare that the western lands west of the Appalachians is to be reserved for the Native Americans. And that was the road to the American dream for a lot of American colonists, was to move and squat upon land to the west. So to them, right, they thought, wait a minute, you just won the French and Indian War and contended that you were partially fighting for us to secure the western periphery for us to go live in. And because remember, right, that I would venture to say that the primary means of socioeconomic advancement was not education, like we would argue today. That was for very select few, and degrees were not expected for almost anything, but was largely through land and becoming a cash crop farmer. And of course, other means were becoming an artisan, a skilled worker, becoming a merchant, selling goods from one place to the next, right? But by and large, at least in American rhetoric, land was always tied to the American dream. Okay. And now the British are cutting that off. Then, under the Sugar Act, right, they began enforcing a tax without the assembly's consent. They ordered their customs officials. They were like the highway patrolmen who were to enforce the navigation laws. Remember, we were technically a mercantilist economy, whereby the English government, parliament, and the king or queen can decide the allocation of resources, who has what rights to do what for a living, to trade in what commodities, through what ports, and to be taxed, oftentimes the royal one-fifth from everything that they have. You had to have papers, the proper papers, if you were a merchant, to be selling the commodities that you were selling, particularly at the place and at the markets where you were selling them. And you to allow the English to first tax your stuff. Okay. And so now the customs officials had developed a reputation for not doing their job. Many of them were poorly paid. Many of them were given that position as a stepping stone to something much more lucrative and more prestigious. So they didn't like their jobs and they saw it as temporary. So hence a lot of them, for instance, began to just take bribes and allow American merchants like, John Hancock and others to enrich themselves without the proper papers, but just paying them the bribe to trade in that commodity. So at any rate, now the British Parliament is trying to kind of stomp down on those abuses and ensure that only those who have the official papers are allowed to do such. 1764 was another big year in that they allowed in Massachusetts, for instance, a local court to decide to reissue expired writs. A WRIT, a writ is like a warrant, a search warrant for the customs officials of the Navy, right, of the Royal English Navy, to stop virtually anyone for virtually any reason on the high seas to make sure that they had the proper papers for what they were engaging in, what type of trade and commodity. So this really hit the pocketbook of merchants, right, like John Hancock and others. And this could have been a private, selfish motivation and them rebelling against England. Okay. They also increased the scope of the vice admiralty courts. And the vice admiralty courts, remember, if people are being um, uh, what's the word I'm thinking of? I'm sorry, my brain's going flat. They're imbibing these ideas from Beccaria and others, right, about natural rights of suspects. This was definitely, in your notion, a violation of those rights, whereby you were brought to a military court. You were not tried by your peers, fellow colonists. And so hence to some, they believed this was against tradition, which had been historically been happening in colonial history, but also against their natural rights as human beings, right? Because remember, the idea of natural right is you're entitled to it by nature of being a human being. Whereas with a civic right, you're citing an actual right that is put down in the English Constitution. And so note that, right, with people like Benjamin Franklin, who spoke on our behalf, they argue both. They argue for our British civic rights, our man-made rights under the English common law, and they also argued under our natural rights as human beings that we were entitled to, whether the English Constitution had yet recognized it or not. Okay, and so then let's see here. Then you had, like I said, Isaac Barr's speech in Parliament with the Stamp Act, the House of Burgesses, the local assembly under 29-year-old Patrick Henry, right? They contend with these resolutions. By the way, they only had four, and the press is going to have a large role, supposedly, in disseminating information and also in being very provocative and provoking anger throughout the colonies. The press played a big role, arguably. So at any rate, although they only passed four resolutions, many newspapers passed 6 to 9 resolutions. So hence they were actually fabricating things and contending that the Virginia House of Burgesses of the elected assembly of the colonial Virginia was stating things that actually were not even true, trying to provoke the citizenry, right? And so at any rate, by and large, they're contending that the elected assembly of Virginia stood up first and said, we defiantly will not recognize, we will not collect taxes without our own consent. because we are not represented in Parliament. So hence it needs our assembly's consent. Rhode Island followed, contended that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional. Eventually, 9 colonial assemblies are going to send reps to a Stamp Act Congress and representing 9 of the 13 colonies and contend the same thing, that they will not obey a tax that has not been given their colonial elected rep assemblies permission. Okay. James Otis, who's going to become a founding father, he at first said we need to submit to Parliament's law. And Thomas Hutchinson, played a good villain in the public's eye because he wrote a private letter to Governor Bernard saying you need to crack down on rebellion against this Stamp Act. Better to step upon toes and even infringe upon liberties for the sake of law and order, for the general well-being of the colonies. That letter was found and put into the press and disseminated. So notice, right, the literati, as I mentioned before, they're imbibing these works from the French Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, right, the Great Awakening, and they're deliberately trying to provoke the citizenry, okay, and they're doing it here as well. And so hence people are going to attack Hutchinson. They're going to attack the customs collectors who go by to enforce the tax, right? They tarred and feathered them. Many of them they threatened to kill. They ransacked their homes, etc., in Massachusetts, in the Boston area. And you have evidence of some members of the local assembly, right? And some of the well-to-do middle-class Bostonians are going to form these Sons of Liberty chapters that are going to spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. And this is extra legal technically, right? Because remember, the English colonies, 9 of the 13 are royal. You have a royally handpicked governor. You have a council, and by this time, oftentimes the council was no longer handpicked by the governor, but was handpicked by the governor and then approved by the assembly. And then you had the lower branch, the assembly, who by that time had kind of garnered through historical evolution and became entitled to feel that they had the right to give their approval to all laws and all taxes, right? The Sons of Liberty were of none of those legalized institutions. They're extra legal technically. And to historians like Gary Nash, Gordon S. Wood, they romanticize this and say, see, it was in the bones, it was in the culture of America to vigilantly guard their rights. Even when they didn't have an actual institution to be their voice, they formed one at a grassroots level, like the Sons of Liberty chapters. So at any rate, the Sons of Liberty went to a guy, Ebenezer, McIntosh, who was literally like a mobster, and got a group of ruffians to go and attack these houses and start riots and start mob violence. Okay, so now things are getting really messy. And at this time also, Benjamin Franklin went before Parliament, and he gave the argument that because English common law was evolutionary, and because one colony after another received a guarantee that they were guaranteed the rights of Englishmen in their original charters, and in that they began to acquire powers, like giving their approval to taxes, giving their approval to laws, being able to try suspects held, for violating mercantilist restrictions by a trial of jury of their peers. That once they had begun to do that under English common law, they had now acquired that right as Englishmen. And so he namely gave more of the civic rights argument than he did the natural rights argument, even though he adhered to natural rights philosophy. He knew that wasn't going to stand as well with the English Parliament. So he took the more technical route of civil rights. And they not only kind of dealt with him high-handedly and arrogantly and claiming that Parliament spoke for them, whether they liked it or not, whether they were directly elected into Parliament or not, but they also contended that he was a rabble rouser for being a part of disseminating Thomas Hutchinson's letter to the press. And so he was infuriated by the British Parliament and humiliated by them. and came back, and he said, I will make the Parliament and the crown a little thing in the eyes of the American people. So he actually boasted that he was going to be a troublemaker through the written word after he returned from England. Benjamin Franklin, that is. So at any rate, um, you have all this going on, but notice, right, uh, with the Townshend Acts, with the Sugar Act, and these taxes on commodities, England is going to drop all of them except for the tax on tea, as a reminder that England was in control. And also, they issued the Declaratory Act, and that made it finally clear, supposedly, after all this time, that Parliament is the virtual representative of everyone in the British realms, period, and all their colonies and Great Britain itself. That Parliament speaks for the people, whether people are directly, represented in Parliament or not through their borough, their district. So now, but to the Americans, of course, there was too little too late, and many Americans refused to recognize that declaratory act. So then, like I said, you had taxes on lead, paint, glass, tea. They were nominal in the degree to which they were, burdensome. They were not high at all, but it was the principle the protesters contended. Right? They moved vice admiralty courts into the places where smuggling was most rife: Philadelphia, Boston, Charleston. Right? And to try to make lessons of these people, examples of these smugglers before the people of their own cities. And to some sources, this backfired, right? And so notice they also, under the Townshend Acts, they moved the troops into the coastal cities. And people are imbibing the Scottish Enlightenment, whether they're directly reading Hoadley and Trenchard and Gordon and these guys are not. The American literati are summarizing their views in the newspapers and in kind of, palatable form for the people to be able to read just in a couple pages in a newspaper, etc. And the Scottish Enlightenment said, beware of a standing army, because historically, right, eventually a strong government will turn its ugly head against its own people and have its military devour its own population. So this is going to lead to the Boston Massacre, right, and other things. They also had, under the Sugar Act, they had at the time the Mutiny Act, or the Quartering Act, whereby you were to allow the soldiers to come in and take what they needed from your home. They could commandeer what they needed, whether you wanted it or not. And of course, there was a large outcry against this, especially in light of the Scottish Enlightenment's ideas percolating throughout the colonies. So then Massachusetts is going to issue a circular whereby this is going to kind of culminate arguably in 1772 with the Committees of Correspondence, where they are going to agree, the assemblies and the different colonies, they're going to disseminate ideas and news to one another so that they could coordinate together, right? So when infringements upon their rights were happening in Rhode Island, that people in Virginia will become apprised of it and could do something about it. So the royal governor of Massachusetts, he issued an ultimatum to the elected assembly of Massachusetts and stated, you must revoke this circular because this is bordering on treason. And they voted 92 against 17 to keep the circular going. And the Committees of Correspondence will, in fact, be established. All right. So we're heading to violence. We're heading to a war for independence. Okay. The Daughters of Liberty and other organizations issued the boycott as a political weapon. And that was rather effective, supposedly, according to the primary sources, whereby, okay, you're going to put a tax on this commodity, then we're not going to buy it because Parliament did not get the consent of our local assembly. We're just not going to buy your product. So then, as a lobbyist faction, the English merchants are going to begin to put pressure on Parliament that represents them fairly well as the bourgeoisie, right back in Parliament. They contend, guys, you need to come to some type of an agreement with the colonies because they're no longer buying our stuff and we're losing money. We're losing revenue from these taxes. All right. So notice the Massachusetts Assembly was dissolved. That's their political voice. Now it's dissolved. So what they're going to do is through a morphing of the Sons of Liberty chapters, the committees of correspondence, and the actual members of the dissolved assembly, they're going to begin to meet in secret in defiance of the British royal governors and royal councils, right? And of course, English Parliament and Crown, George III, and they're beginning to contend that they still extra legally speak for the colonial people. So now the chasm, right, is becoming almost inseparable. Not inseparable. It's becoming impassable, where it's gonna where the famous quote was, "The die is cast. We've already thrown the dice. Now we just fate is going to see what becomes of it." So the New York Assembly was also dissolved because they refused to acknowledge the Quartering Act. And so with pressure from the merchants, they're going to repeal every tax except that on tea. Any questions so far? All right, with the Boston Massacre, it started over a fist fight between a colonist and a soldier who was trying to get a side job at a rope making factory. The soldier was given the job. The colonist resented and felt like he was entitled to that job because the soldier already had a job, albeit he was paid poorly for it, and that the job should go to him, the colonist, instead. They had an altercation and it led into a fist fight. The colonist got the better of him. The soldier came back to his barracks. They saw that a soldier had been attacked by a colonist. They went after this colonist. The colonist went to Preston Brooks for his protection as a leader of the British troops, and said, "Please don't let your troops attack me." And then they began verbally sparring, and a crowd of people surrounded them, began throwing snowballs and rocks and cursing louder and louder against the soldiers. To this day, no one knows if the order was given or not, or if it was more of a spontaneous reaction. But the soldiers fired into the crowd and killed 5 people. And then American propagandists just ran with this, right? Calling it the Boston Massacre. Unarmed Bostonians are being fired upon by their own soldiers that are supposed to be there to protect them and to preserve law and order. And so this is the Scottish Enlightenment's fears coming into fruition, and to the perception of a lot of Americans reading their newspapers. All right. So pamphlets take off. Dickinson, Otis, Adams, Paine, the other Adams, Jefferson, etc. Right. And particular, right, that by, gosh, I'm thinking of his face, Thomas Paine, known as Common Sense. And he basically says, right, that, guys, by the way, what is a king besides a usurper of a throne? George III may not have usurped the throne, but you go back along the line through the Stuart kings, etc., and eventually you just get back to the biggest caveman who clubbed other people and took the throne. He says, so what is a throne really, that we should adhere to it? So he's committing philosophical regicide. He's trying to get Americans to no longer have deference for a king or a queen and to no longer want one, right? So supposedly his pamphlet was big as far as being influential psychologically with the masses. Then he said, right, we become self-sufficient economically. We are more powerful, economically more affluent than little England, the little island of England and Scotland itself. So why they need us more than we need them? So why are we holding on to our ties to Mother England? And Benjamin Franklin had stated that as well. And so at any rate, you have all that going on. Committees of correspondence are formed. Then the Tea Act. They already had a tea without our permission, a tax on tea. Then to add insult to injury regarding the commodity of tea, they gave a monopoly to the English East India Company. So then on December 16th, 1773, the Sons of Liberty chapter of Boston dumped 10,000 shillings worth of tea into Boston Harbor. All right. And then thereafter came the coercive acts. They shut down Boston Harbor. The councilmen were now to be chosen without assembly's consent because there was no longer an assembly that was recognized by the English government. Vice Admiralty courts were now to be given overseas. So if you were tried as a smuggler, they take you overseas, and chances are your family never saw you again, according to American propaganda, right? And then the Quebec Act, they simultaneously rewarded the French Canadians for being obedient during this time of American defiance and gave them rights as French Catholics that they did not give to us and representation, etc. And so this was definitely seen as a defiant contrast. So, and we developed the first Continental Congress in September of 1774. We issued Enlightenment notions. We quoted oppositional philosophers. We cited Christian and Great Awakening rhetoric as well. Also, notations to classical Greece and Rome in our proclamations against the English Parliament and against George III, the King of England. All right. And so then at this time in Lexington and Concord, it was noted that the assemblies were illegally meeting up, that people were beginning to boast because the colonial militias, right? Remember, according to the Scottish Enlightenment, that was to stay democratized, where each village or town got to democratically decide on its own captains, and they'd meet once a week, oftentimes on Saturdays, and do shooting practice and just drink, etc. But they were to guard American liberties, etc. So when this was happening, the militias, technically under the umbrella of the British Armed Forces, now had to make a choice. And so the militiamen who were deciding to join the rebellion, they were beginning to call themselves Minutemen, that they would be ready at a minute's notice to defend American rights, even in fighting against their previous comrades and leaders in the British Army. And so General Thomas Gage was sent to round up these rabble-rousing, defiant men and arrest them. And whatever cache of military equipment they were trying to stockpile, he was to confiscate that in Concord, Massachusetts. But on his way there in the famous Lexington Green, the illegal militiamen who had left the established militia, they were kind of a ragtag group on the Lexington Green. They refused to give ground. They were warned twice, and the British fired into them and killed 13 of them in Lexington. And then when they went to Concord
It looks like this device isn't
sorry.
registered. You can find setup instructions in the help section of your Alexa app.
No, thank you, Alexa. Lexington was too close to that word. But at any rate, when they went to Concord, they arrested a handful of people. They acquired a cache of weapons.
It
And
looks like this device isn't
sorry about
registered.
that, you guys.
You can find
On the
setup
way back to
instructions in the help
Boston,
section of your Alexa app.
the illegal militiamen, the Minutemen, began sniping them and firing upon them and killing dozens of them, of the British troops. And so by this time, the die was cast. They put out one more olive branch petition to King George III, contending that they didn't want to fight against Mother England, but if he would just give some concessions and step in against his own parliament. And of course, he refused to do that. He was a young man. Some say he had an inferiority complex coming from a grandpa who couldn't even speak English, coming from the German Hanoverian dynasty, and felt like he had something to prove. Take that, with a grain of salt, but that may have contributed to things as well. So at any rate, there you have it. We're gonna break out into a war for independence from April of 1775 to the summer of 1783, and obviously we're gonna win. The British largely are going to give up. It's not so much that we definitively won, but the British decided to stop fighting. There was a lot of dissension. They're going to have fist fights back in Parliament between those who wanted to give some concessions to their American cousins and those who wanted to put us in our place. When you look at the military history, the British had us on the ropes in 1776. They almost knocked us out immediately. They had our men cornered on Long Island, on Manhattan, and they didn't finish us off. On a couple different occasions, we famously had fog come in, roll in just on the right night, and our guys survived and escaped to fight another day. We also, after Saratoga, got the French to ally with us, and the French really helped us out as well. We began to fight with guerrilla warfare tactics. Remember, guerrilla is little war in Spanish. And so, little warfare, we began to stop taking them on toe to toe, which we could not contend with mighty England's armed forces, and began to hit their supply lines, have surprise raids and ambushes, and then run and break up and hide and use speed and the element of surprise instead. And so the British they also didn't have a really good strategy. They tried to win major cities, which they often did, and we would just hide out like at Valley Forge when they took Philadelphia. We just waited for them to leave and attack them again. So just taking cities was not effective. The French helped us a lot. The British could have knocked us off in 1776, but didn't quite finish us off. All these things are seen as kind of contingency, like what if things had gone just a little differently, we could have easily lost the war for independence. And then at Yorktown, there were 3 French soldiers for every defiant American soldier, and they wanted to even surrender to the French instead of us because of the shame involved. Lord Cornwallis, that is. But he's going to surrender to us at Yorktown, and that was the largest remaining contingent of British soldiers. And the British back in England could not get enough votes in Parliament to pass to send more boys over here to fight because they didn't want any more of their boys to die in this controversial, unpopular war back in England itself. So they're going to give up on us, and we're going to gain our independence from that in 1783. But in the meantime, we're going to try a confederation, okay? And we're going to get to that next meeting. But let's see here. So notice numbers 1, 2, and 3, okay? Number 1 is the salutary neglect thesis, the thesis that we were neglected by Mother England, but it had a healthy effect upon us. So during that neglect, our assemblies acquired power after power, and you see examples of that in this section. And our people did what they wanted economically and enriched themselves because the mercantilist restrictions by way of the navigation laws were not being carried out here in North America. So we became wealthy, powerful, um, uh, developed a sense of entitlement with our assemblies gaining power after power. So hence, if you adhere to this thesis, it wasn't so much a romantic revolution. We were fighting to keep a good thing going. We were left alone and we did well for ourselves. And then dad tries to come home suddenly when you're already 18, 19 years old and doing well for yourself and says, okay, son or daughter, I'm going to begin, upholding the restrictions and laws that you're under. And the son or daughter says, sorry, dad, too little, too late. I've had it good for too long. I'm self sufficient now. I no longer need you. I'm going to fight to keep this good thing going, this independence going. So that's number 1, okay, if you choose to do that one, and that's on the test. Number 2 is court history, that this was a revolution, that it was about ideas, that it was about principles, right? Those principles were brought forth through the literati of American readers and put into form with pamphlets, newspaper articles, etc., that the people themselves could absorb and that they became enlightened themselves, the American people. And we began fighting for this country as a special country that is enlightened. Okay? So that's the history that we got as children, the romantic version. Then 3 seems to insinuate through people like George Washington that our founding fathers were very ambitious, very selfishly ambitious, and there was a wall that they could not surpass, according to the laws of patronage, whereby the royal governors decided who would get what opportunities and who would not, based upon bloodline and not merit. And to people like George Washington, it should be open to merit, right? And so he was furious as a leader in the armed forces, as an officer, as well as a cash crop farmer. He was furious that he could not do his own thing without the English getting in the way and as an obstacle to his ambitions. So hence he was fighting largely for selfish reasons, according to Joseph Ellis, because in the British world, he couldn't make it as high as he wanted to become. Okay. But I would say that it's mildly revisionist, his book, because he also contends that to George Washington, it was only fair that people should make it as high as their merit, as their talents could take them, and that the British patronage system was unfair and foolish. Okay. So keep that in mind for number three. And Howard Zinn, a very cynical thesis, as he looks at the fighting between the haves and the have-nots, the poor and the well-to-do, those on the western frontiers versus those in the established eastern cities, and says, I see a movement of the poor rearing its ugly head, right? And that the well-to-do middle class in America, they had their own agenda. They wanted the British kicked out because they could become the top dogs with the British removed. And so they also didn't want the poor's anti well to do sentiment to turn its ugly head against them, their fellow well to do colonialists. So hence, they, as shrewd and cunning as they were, they took over this rebellion of the poor, right? They hijacked the movement, so to speak, and they used the British as a scapegoat and said, we're not the issue, the problem for your issues. The British are. Fight for us, and they use the Enlightenment as propaganda, saying, we promise you a land of more opportunities, of more political participation and more rights, etc., if you'll fight with and for us. So that's something to think about. And that they use the carrot and the stick, that they began using coercive measures through the Continental Army against the common people to force them to fight for their own independence, and the carrot and promising them land and wages, etc., and a better land with their propaganda if they were to fight for them against the British. So a very cynical thesis. All right. Are there any questions on this War for Independence assignment? Are you guys with me? Can I get a thumbs up? Thank you, Xander. What an intriguing subject, right? Our War for Independence. So whether you believe we were fighting, thank you, Aaron, that we were fighting to keep a good thing going, that's known as the salutary neglect thesis, where you would hear, thank you, Mary, to the court history, that this was truly a revolution fought upon lofty principles, or whether you're highly revisionist like Howard Zinn, and you think a group of demagogues, of manipulators of the people in the form of the founding fathers, were scared by a popular uprising and used the British as a convenient scapegoat by hijacking this rebellion. That's up to you. But please read them all. All of the sections will have a question tied to them on test number 2. But go ahead and just pick one to analyze, pick apart, and evaluate. You guys are doing a great job. And I don't have to say that. I mean that. I'm proud of you. You're good students. Okay. So any other questions? Any last minute questions with which I need to become familiar?
Wednesday's lecture, what time? It's not posted.
So as soon as I could post this one, I'll have it up. It'll probably be later this afternoon. Oftentimes it takes at least an hour just for it to download onto YouTube and then being able to put it up subsequently. So it'll be this afternoon when I put this one up. And like I said, I won't always do this, but I'm thinking I'm going to give a separate Zoom meeting again this week, a second one on Wednesday. Wednesday at 2:30. Okay. And I'll do the second, the fifth assignment, or is it the sixth? The following assignment on the Confederation, our first government that we tampered with at this time of the Revolutionary War. Because remember, both of them are due, right? Where's my paper? Both of them are due. Let's see here. On Wednesday night, the 30th. So I would highly recommend, if you can, especially being present to this, you don't need to wait for it to download. I would think jump on this as soon as possible, so you give yourself ample time to do one more assignment by Wednesday night. Okay. So I hope this was of some assistance to you. I know there's a lot of information on this subject. So I'll tell you what I'll go ahead and do is I'll bid the class as a whole adieu and say goodbye. If you want to hang on and refuse to leave, one or two of you, I'll be happy to address any personal questions or comments you have, okay? So if you don't have any personal questions or comments, we'll go ahead and call it a day on the War for Independence assignment. I have your names down. You'll get your extra credit. You've certainly earned that, and I thank you. So if you don't have any further questions, have a good week, okay? Or hopefully, again, I could see you again on Wednesday. Thank you,
Thank you,
Robert.
Professor. Have a good day.
You too, Xander. Thank you.
Bye, Professor.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you for hanging in there. Okay, so now that we're down to just a few, can I have someone unmute and ask me any question or comment you like? Either of you? Erica, do you have one? I believe I'm getting one from Rupi. Rupinder, you have any comments? And Erica, you're muted as well, in case you're wanting to ask me something. Okay, because I can't hear anything, okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting. If you're having technical difficulties, just, I guess, send me a Canvas message. All right, have a good day, okay? Bye, Erica.